Hello there, Ben Bowers, the Spirit Specialist, and this is the accompanying video that goes along with the Discovery of Whisky box set that I have produced in conjunction with Gordon MacPhail. Full disclosure, my previous employer, but I have put this box together as a way of showing what Gordon MacPhail are able to do with their portfolio of whiskies, but also provide a selection box for people that are looking to delve a little bit more into the differences between different types of cask maturation. People who might not necessarily be aware of kind of exactly what the difference is between, say, sherry maturation, bourbon maturation. A lot of whiskies will say it on the back label, oh, bourbon matured and sherry matured and all that lot, but what does that even mean, and what does that do to the flavour profile? Which was the entire point of Gordon MacPhail putting the Discovery range together. So what I'm going to do through this video, if you've bought a pack and you're wanting to try them, you don't have to try them all in one go. There is no sort of strict tasting event in terms of I haven't got anything set up. This video accompanies this box set and you are welcome to dip in and out as you wish. So what I will do is I will give you a bit of background information about Gordon MacPhail themselves, to give you a bit of context about the company that have produced this range of whiskies. And then I will also do a video, as I do with most of my review videos, with a background detail about each particular distillery itself. Now, I'm not gonna then drink a sample of them and give you my thoughts. I've got a bit of a head cold and it's also quite early in the morning, so the combination of the two probably isn't gonna do me and you any favors. But what I will do is, in the show notes, I will basically break down the video. So if you did want to kind of do this over the course of a few nights, or you actually were going, well, I might try the sherry ones first and I'll go back to the bourbon and things like that, there will be some timestamps on the show notes, which means you can jump to each particular one. So for each of these, you will get background information about the distillery in question. So we've got Tomatin, we've got Aultmore, we've got Miltonduff, some relatively unknown distilleries. So I quite like to give you the context in terms of the history of the distillery itself. In that blurb, there will also be just a brief overview about the tasting notes themselves. So they're based on my tasting notes as well as the official tasting notes, to give you some kind of indication of what to expect in terms of the flavour profile. But the flavour profile that you get is completely personal. It is absolutely down to you. So what I would suggest is, if you are trying these, not necessarily all in one go, but if you're trying the two bourbons together, try one, have a little sip, leave the rest in the bottle handily. They've got lids, so you don't have to drink the whole thing in one go. But have a little taste of, say, the Tomatin, and then try the Aultmore immediately after, and maybe go back to the Tomatin. So if you didn't want to do all these in one night, might be really good to do them across 3 nights and do the bourbon 2 first, then the sherry 2, then the smoky 2. And you've at least then got the context between the two of them, rather than bourbon against sherry against smoky. But if you can leave a little bit in the bottle, if you've done the bourbon first, for example. Now, I have put these in the box. These are listed in an order that I would do a running order of if I was doing a tasting of all 6 in one go. So I would start with the Tomatin, then have the Aultmore. I'd have the 2 bourbons first because they're a little bit lighter, a little bit fresher than the sherry, and then we have the smoky element at the end of it. If you did the bourbon ones after the smoky ones, you're still going to have that kind of smoky aspect in there, which is going to affect the true flavour of the bourbon. So if I was doing this as a tasting of all 6, and if you want to do that of an evening with some friends, not a problem at all. That is the running order that I would do them. So, enough about that. You've also got the code on here, which will give you 10% off any 70cl bottle from these 6. And that is also multiple. So if you wanted to buy 2 or 3 bottles, you would get 10% off the whole lot. 10%, they are sold retail at $49.99. So you are getting a $5 off. So this is knocking them down to $44.99, but that 10% discount code will give you that £5 equivalent off on any bottle, so multiple bottles. So if you want to buy a bottle of the Aultmore and the Miltonduff and the Bunnahabhain, you'll get 10% off, you get £5 off each bottle. So without further ado, let me give you some background information about Gordon MacPhail, the company itself.
Gordon MacPhail was originally a grocery store which opened in Elgin in 1895 by James Gordon and John Alexander MacPhail, and which still exists to this day. The business is now a spirits distributor, wholesaler, and more importantly, a maturer of single malt Scotch whiskies that is currently in the 4th generation of ownership by the Urquhart family. John Urquhart started working for Gordon MacPhail as an apprentice in 1896 and worked his way up into sourcing and blending whiskies from nearby distilleries to sell to local customers. He eventually became the owner of the business following MacPhail's retirement in 1915 and Gordon's passing in 1917. Whereas independent bottlers purchased casks of whisky already matured, Gordon and MacPhail have purchased new make spirit from a variety of Scotch distilleries since the early 1900s, maturing them in their own hand-picked casks thanks to relationship built up over many years. Indeed, G&M can be considered to be one of the key factors of single malt Scotch whisky becoming so popular, due in part to the Connoisseur's Choice range that was created by George Urquhart, John's son, in 1971, highlighting the individual character of separate distilleries that were otherwise lost within blending. Such is the phenomenal archive of casks that G&M carefully look after, the company has been able to release some of the oldest whiskies ever bottled. A 75-year-old Mortlach in 2015, and more recently, an 80-year-old Glenlivet in 2021. In 1993, the business purchased the Benromach distillery as a way of future-proofing against a downturn in supply from distilleries, given the increased worldwide popularity of Scotch whisky. In 2022, the Cairn distillery opened, this time a purpose-built modern distilling venture which adds another string to the company's bow. Gordon MacPhail previously had a somewhat convoluted portfolio of brands, which was confusing to both consumers and, speaking from experience, even those working within the company itself. So, in 2019, a major rebranding took place, streamlining the selection of releases to provide clarity and better choice to consumers. The Connoisseur's Choice branding remains as a selection of predominantly single cask strength bottlings, although some releases at 46% or those that have undergone a finish in some type of wine cask are also available under this banner. Private Collection is a range of bottlings at a much older age or from closed distilleries and represent just how skilled the team in the warehouses are at tending to spirit within cask. But G&M didn't want to forget about drinkers who were beginning their journey into Scotch whisky appreciation and as such introduced the Discovery range. This more affordable selection of bottlings highlight the differences between 3 core flavour profiles found within the Scotch whisky category: maturation in ex-bourbon casks, providing vanilla and soft citrus fruit notes; time spent in barrels that previously held sherry wines to imbue rich and dark fruitcake tones; and the smoky effect of burning peat when drying the barley through the germination process before fermentation. As a result, drinkers can discover what type of Scotch they might prefer, and also discover releases from distilleries they may not have previously even considered. Not only does the Discovery range appeal to drinkers dipping their toe into the water of life, it also gives seasoned Scotch whisky fans the chance to enjoy some fantastic drams without breaking the bank. Contrary to what some people might think, whisky and other spirits don't age in the bottle. Aging and maturation, which are one and the same thing, takes place purely in wooden casks, and even then in a specific part of the cask itself. Maturation is all about the interaction between spirit and wood, whereby the new make spirit in question, that's clear as it runs off the still, soaks into the porous wooden staves and draws out colour and flavour compounds from within. Oh, and at this point I should point out that a cask and a barrel are basically the same thing. Some people will differentiate depending on the size of the container, but for the purpose of this discussion, cask and barrel are interchangeable words as big wooden containers used for spirit maturation. In terms of Scotch whisky regulations, only after 3 years maturation in casks can spirit then be called whisky. Before that point, it's strictly speaking a cask-aged barley vodka. Distillation has taken place for centuries, and it was discovered that transporting spirit in a wooden barrel of some form changed the flavour of the liquid, whereas the likes of clay pots wouldn't. Whilst there are plenty of complex scientific studies explaining the precise nature of this interaction and development of the spirit over time, there's still a weird alchemy going on that means that 2 casks made from the same tree with the same run of spirit filled into it will still produce slight differences in flavour between them. Oak is the wood of choice to mature spirits, mainly because it's sturdy enough to hold liquid for a long time without leaking or breaking down, but still providing a complex flavour profile to the spirit. Brand new oak casks have to be treated in order to maximise the potential flavour it can offer, so they are charred with flames inside, partly to seal the barrel and also to caramelise the sugars and elements inside the wood, which are then drawn into the resulting spirit. Because of the porosity of the wood, there is evaporation of the liquid inside to the outside air, known romantically as the angel's share. Depending on the climate, this can be anything between 2% and 10% of the volume per year. The hotter the climate, the more is lost through evaporation, but conversely, there is also more interaction between spirit and wood as a result, so some people argue warmer regions mature at a so-called faster rate. It was also discovered that if the barrel in question had previously held some kind of wine or other spirit, this in turn would take the flavour profile in another direction. As sherry wine barrels were shipped into countries such as Scotland and emptied for bottling, the otherwise useless casks were then reused by distillers wanting to store their wares, only to return to them later to find out that the spirit had dramatically changed, more often than not for the better. As a result, sherry barrels are the dominant type of cask used to mature Scotch whisky in the main. However, due to the low demand for sherry wines itself, this means there are no longer aged sherry barrels available for distilleries to mature their spirit. As such, these days new casks are seasoned with sherry. Oloroso is the most popular type of sherry wine to be used. The sherry rests inside a new cask for a short amount of time to soak into the wood before moving to a new barrel and being topped up. Alternatively, the sherry is then turned into vinegar, as while it's great for seasoning a cask for spirit maturation, it's not actually that pleasant to drink. On average, a cask will be seasoned for around 2 to 3 years before being transported to a distillery or brand to be filled. Bourbon whiskey is a specific type of whiskey made in America that has to adhere to certain regulations. To be called bourbon, the spirit has to be distilled from a minimum of 51% corn and matured in barrels that have not had anything else in beforehand, otherwise known as virgin casks. So bourbon whiskies are matured in oak barrels that are charred before filling, but once that whiskey has been disgorged, it's essentially useless to a bourbon producer. But it's still usable for other countries who do not have that regulation, and so bourbon barrels became a viable source for maturation around the world. Something else to bear in mind is the type of oak itself. American oak has a different structure to European oak, resulting in slight differences in flavour when maturing spirit. However, while some brands proclaim their whiskey is matured in American oak, this doesn't necessarily mean it's an ex-bourbon cask, as some sherry producers do use American oak for their wines. Bourbon casks tend to impart light, creamy characters with notes of vanilla and light citrus. Sherry casks, at risk of a sweeping generalisation, more often than not introduce darker fruit notes and soft spice tones, similar to rich fruitcakes. Something you may also spot on a whisky label is mention of first or second fill. This is actually quite a key factor in the flavour profile of a spirit, but something that's often ignored in marketing in particular. A barrel that has previously held sherry, bourbon, or another type of wine or spirit will offer up the most amount of colour and flavour the first time it is filled with new make spirit. That cask will still have something to give once the whisky or whatever spirit has been emptied, but just not as much as the first go. Think of it a bit like a tea bag. The first time you put a tea bag into a cup of hot water, it will give out good colour and flavour. Dunk the bag in a second cup, and there'll still be some colour and flavour, just not as much, and a third cup even less so. And so this is the case with reusing the same barrel for maturing spirit. After a couple of times, it simply hasn't got enough left to provide depth and complexity. So first fill is the first time new make spirit goes into a cask after something else has been rested inside it. Second fill is the following use, and third fill onwards tends not to happen too much unless a brand is trying to keep costs down. As you might expect, a first fill cask is much more valuable than a second fill. But what about smoke and peat? Again, this is basically the same thing. The use of peat creates a smoky flavour profile. Part of the whisky making process involves the germination of grain by soaking it in water, in the case of single malt whisky, barley, until it starts to sprout. This fills the grain with the largest amount of starches and sugars that then convert to alcohol with the introduction of a yeast. So the sprouting process needs to be stopped as quickly as possible by drying it out to then be milled. Traditionally, this was done by laying the wet grain on a stone floor under which a fire was lit to dry it out without actually cooking it. Wood is a great source of fire, but it's also really handy to build things with, so an alternative source was found that was also plentiful: the soil under our feet. Peat is the compacted layers of soil that have been compressed over many years. If you cut a chunk out of the ground and dry it out, it makes a great tool for burning. Chemical compounds within the peat, known as phenols, permeate the drying barley through the smoke that's given off, making its way through the stone, and this is what then provides a distinctive smoky profile throughout the rest of the spirit making process. Some people will talk about the influence of water running through fields of peat, and while this was a minor factor way back in the day, with the processes that are required to make the water used in whisky making as safe as possible for consumption, this is now basically a load of romantic nonsense. So the smoky notes you'll find in a whisky are purely from the drying of the barley and nothing else, and no, liquid smoke can't be used either. But something to bear in mind is that smoke itself has different flavours. Peat from around Scotland offers vastly different tones depending on where it's sourced from. Islay peat is well known for more medicinal influences, whereas other islands such as Skye tend to feature peppery notes. Aultmore peat is closer to bonfire smoke, and peat in the Highlands of Scotland around Aberdeenshire have more floral tones thanks to increased quantities of heather within it. You can also get hints of smoked meats, saltiness, greenery, all sorts of things going on. So it's nigh on impossible to simply lump all peaty whiskies under the same banner, despite what some people say. So, hopefully that gives you a bit of background info into the flavour profiles the Discovery range are going to feature and why they're present in the whiskies you'll enjoy. So, let's now take a look at each sample within the pack in more detail. Founded in 1897, Tomatin is a Highland distillery 15 miles southeast of Inverness on the northeast edge of the Cairngorms. The distillery was massively expanded from 1956 to 1974, by which point it was the largest distillery in Scotland in terms of output. However, it unfortunately never ran at full capacity, as a considerable downturn in the whisky market began to hit at exactly the same time, and in 1985 the distillery went into liquidation. The following year, Takara Shuzo and Okara and Company, two bulk purchasers of Tomatin stocks, purchased the distillery, making it the first Scotch whisky distillery to be owned by a Japanese business. The main focus for the new owners was on producing whisky for blending in brands such as Antiquary, thanks to its distinctive flavour profile of orchard and tropical fruits, but it was at the turn of the millennium that single malt releases began to increase in number. The Discovery bottling by Gordon MacPhail is a 2009 vintage distillate that was bottled in 2021, matured solely in ex-bourbon barrels to impart a silky flavour profile of pear, melon and white chocolate with a slightly peppery finish. Aultmore is a distillery in Keith, Banffshire, dating back to 1895 when it was founded by Alexander Edward, the then owner of the Ben Rinnes distillery. A troubled start, thanks to an industry crash in 1901 and the events of World War I, saw it settle into regular production for blended whiskies from the 1920s onwards, particularly as a key component of Dewar's White Label, until it was entirely rebuilt and expanded in 1970. In 1998, the John Dewar & Sons brand was sold by owners Diageo to Bacardi, and rumour has it that the deal wouldn't go ahead unless the Aultmore distillery was included, as part due to its importance as a blending malt due to its light and fragrant but still substantial character. Indeed, it was such the case that it wasn't until 2004 that an official bottling of Aultmore single malt was lodged to the public. The Discovery bottling by Gordon MacPhail is a 10-year-old matured solely in thirst-filled bourbon barrels, producing a light and creamy character of apple, peach and vanilla custard with just a touch of floral jasmine. A Speyside distillery based 3 miles southwest of Elgin, the Miltonduff distillery was founded in 1824, but it's strongly believed distilling had been going on in Milton Farm for many years before that. The Duff in Miltonduff comes from the Duff family, who owned the farm estate at the time it was officially founded. The distillery was purchased by Hiram Walker in 1936, and the whisky became a key part of the Ballantyne's blend. A pair of Lomond stills were installed in 1964. This hybrid of pot and column still was invented by Alistair Cunningham, an engineer with Hiram Walker, in 1955. However, issues with consistency and safety meant they were decommissioned in 1981. If you ever come across a single malt named Moss Towie, this is whisky from Miltonduff distilled in those Lomond stills. The house style of Miltonduff whisky is traditionally light and somewhat grassy, which makes it particularly susceptible to incorporating the rich, fruity flavours offered by maturation in ex-sherry casks. As such, the Discovery bottling from Gordon MacPhail is a 10-year-old whisky that is incredibly deep and dark, with notes of raisins, stewed plums, milk chocolate and soft winter spices, with just a touch of nuttiness. Situated on the northeast coast on the Isle of Islay, 4 miles north of Portiskeag, Bunnahabhain was built in 1881 at a cost of £30,000, the equivalent to £2.6 million today. Bunnahabhain is Scottish Gaelic for mouth of the river. The distillery is sited where the Margadale River meets the sea. Indeed, it was supplied solely by boat until a road was constructed in 1960. In 1887, the distillery merged with Glenrothes to become Highland Distillers. The company would eventually become spirits behemoth Edrington Beam Suntory, and Bunnahabhain was a key part of both famous Grouse and Cutty Sark blended whiskies over the years. Along with Black Bottle, the blended whisky which also contained a large proportion of Bunnahabhain single malt, the brand was then sold to Burns-Stewart in 2003, who also owned Deanston and Tobermory. But after Burns-Stewart's parent business went bust 10 years later, it was acquired by current owners Distell. Once marketed as the unpronounceable malt, Bunnahabhain used to be practically unpeated from the 1960s, which was unusual given that nearly all other Islay distilleries focus on heavily peated spirit. Following the takeover by Burns-Stewart, there was a revival in production for more intense smokiness, akin to whiskies produced in the early days of the operation, with about 20% of total production now using peated barley. The two bottlings of Bunnahabhain from the Discovery range by Gordon MacPhail showcased the two extremes of what the distillery is able to offer. The sherry matured 11-year-old release uses unpeated spirit matured solely in ex-Oloroso sherry barrels, mainly first fill, which provide dark fruit notes of plums and dates alongside a hint of pecan and walnut, with a rich and silky finish akin to milk chocolate studded with candied orange peel. On the opposite side of the spectrum, the heavily peated smoky 10-year-old has been matured in ex-bourbon barrels, which introduces a creamy citrus note to a gently dry, slightly ashy smokiness with hints of black pepper and bonfire embers. Just 3 miles south of the Bunnahabhain distillery sits Caol, just next to Portaskeg, the mate port of Islay. Built in 1846, Caol is Scottish Gaelic for Sound of Islay, referencing the stretch of water between Islay and Jura, not what the place actually sounds like. Eventually becoming part of Distillers Company Limited in 1927, the conglomeration that would eventually become drinks behemoth Diageo, the original distillery was demolished in 1972 and a significantly larger operation was built in its place. As a result, Caol is a powerhouse distillery on Islay, to the point at which it was one of the top 10 distilleries in Scotland for overall output in 2015. So important was Caol as a major part of Johnnie Walker blended whiskies, particularly Black Label, an official single malt bottling wasn't available for drinkers until 2002. Caol is one of the most consistent distilleries not just on Islay, but in Scotland as a whole. It's well known for having the same specification of peated malt as Lagavulin, but differences in fermentation time, the point at which the spirit run is cut, and the taller stills in the distillery mean the heavier smoky notes are tempered slightly, resulting in a flavour profile with sweeter notes of tropical fruit and smoked meats while sat behind a beachside bonfire. It's also worth noting that Caol whiskies are not matured on the island, instead aging in Diageo's warehouse complexes found mainly in the central belt of Scotland. The 13-year-old smoky release from Gordon MacPhail's Discovery range is matured in ex-bourbon barrels to accentuate those fruity notes, providing a finish that goes on forever.